Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the presentation on Draggin and Droppin. And I'd like to welcome all three of our distinct audiences. We've got people here who are live. We have those who are watching the live stream. If on the live stream I show up blocky and pixelated, the stream's fine. I just have that effect on cameras. And we usually clean that up in post-processing, but you're watching live, so you're going to have to put up with it. And I'd like to welcome those of you who are from the distant future watching the recording of this presentation, presumably from the comfort of your flying cars. My name is Mark Murphy. You may know of me as CommonsWare and, whoops, wrong tab, and 17,843 current answers out on Stack Overflow related to Android development. Also, I'd love it if you knew me for the book, The Busy Coder's Guide to Android Development, and so forth. And today, we're going to talk about dragging and dropping. And by this, I do not mean how you feel in the morning as you get older, though trust me, there are many days when I am dragging. In this case, I'm referring to drag and drop operations on the Android device, and that's driven by your app that the user can use to manipulate your UI. Quick show of hands, how many of you as a user of an Android device have done something with drag and drop? Most of you, okay. How about those of you watching the video? Are you done drag and drop? Okay, I can't really see you very well on this side of the camera. I'm going to assume that you were raising your hand and that most everyone here did. And that because drag and drop is fairly commonplace from a user experience. You long press on the launcher icon and you get to drag it to be a shortcut on the home screen. Or you long press the launcher icon and the little uninstall shortcut or hotspot pops up and you drag the icon over there to uninstall the app because that app just, you didn't want it. Or you're reordering the tracks in a playlist or the slides or photos in some sort of a slideshow or something like that. But on the whole, while from a user standpoint at the device level, drag and drop is something that most users will have done, at the individual app level, it's really not all that common. Many Android apps have no drag and drop capability at all, despite the fact that we've had drag and drop in Android since API level 11. How many of you are actively maintaining an app whose min SDK version is below 11? So drag and drop is available to all of you, and that whether you use it directly or possibly through some sort of a wrapper library. Now, some of these wrapper libraries, and that particularly for ones that are reordering things in like a list view or a recycler view, may not be using the drag and drop framework itself. They may implement it more on their own using low-level touch events. That's mainly because, classically, with drag and drop, you are limited in scope to whatever's on the screen at one point in time. And with one activity on these sorts of screens, we don't really have anywhere to go to, and stuff like that. And so drag and drop historically has been kind of one of those dusty little corners of the SDK that some developers will expose and make use of, and that a lot will ignore. Well, Android 7.0 shipped. Nougat, Nugget, Nougat, Naked Snickers, whatever you want to call it. And that gave us multi-window. Compared to rolling your own drag and drop using low-level touch events, the framework's drag and drop allows you to drag between windows, meaning in particular drag and drop between apps. Split screen environment, two apps, you can drag from this app into that app. And so drag and drop is going to become a lot more important because users are going to start to think about, hey, I'm used to being able to drag and drop on desktop operating systems and whatnot. Shouldn't I be able to do this on my phone, on my tablet, on my flying car, whatever? And therefore, we should be thinking about how we can add this to our apps. And so in this presentation, I'm going to run through how the framework's drag and drop implementation you can take advantage of. In general, we need to register drop targets. We need to say to the framework, hey, this thing over here, we're willing to accept drop events, where the thing is some sort of view or view group. Then, somewhere along the line, particularly for inactivity or in our own app drag and drop, we're going to initiate the drag and drop operation. We're going to say, oh, okay, well, the user long clicked on this, or they tapped on that thing, or whatever. It's time to do a drag and drop. And you're going to specify, this is what we're dragging and dropping, both in terms of the data and in terms of the visual representation. What's the user see under their finger as they are moving it around the screen? The drop target is then notified about, hey, this drag and drop started. Oh, hey, the user dragged inside of you and things like that. So that drop target might do some rendering to help hint to the user that, hey, if you drop this thing here, I will do something useful for you. And finally, if the user does actually drop over one of those targets, that target is told about this, and that target can then go do something useful. So we need to register these drop targets. The typical way you'll wind up doing that is you'll call setOnDragListener on the viewer view group that represents where you're dropping things. You'll provide an implementation of an OnDragListener interface, or you'll have one method you need to worry about, onDrag. That's called with a drag event, and what you do in there gets a little complicated because the API is a little on the clunky side. We'll get into all the dirty details of what those drag events are and what you've got to do in response to the onDrag call here coming up shortly. If you've got your own custom view, and so you've already subclassed view, you've overridden on draw, on measure, on layout, so forth, and that you could elect to say you're going to override on drag event rather than using a separate listener. That's really up to you. Do you consider drag and drop to be more of a view thing or more of a presenter controller-ish sort of thing? And that there is no right or wrong answer from the API standpoint. It's really a question of how you approach your GUI architecture. So, one of the sample apps that I'm going to be showing you bits from, I have when run on a larger screen, so on like a tablet, I've got kind of a side-by-side presentation. On the one side, I have a recycler view that is showing a vertically scrolling list of the videos that are on the device, using Media Store to query for the available videos and rendering them with titles and thumbnails inside of the list. And that recycler view is set up to support drag and drop. And so if you long press on one of those rows in the list, the user can drag to the other side of the screen where I have a video view for playing back the video, and I have a larger image view for showing a blown up rendition of the thumbnail. I'm not going to go through all of the code for dealing with Media Store and recycler view and whatnot, and that if you want to talk about any of those things, and that we can talk about those offline, and that, or did I mention that I have a book? But we're going to focus more on the drag and drop bits. So I have one of those activity things, and inside that activity I have that video view and the image view that I mentioned, and so I'm calling setOnDragListener on each of those. Those are my drop targets. I want to be able to drag into the video view, I want to be able to drag into the large image view. So I'm calling setOnDragListener. I provide an implementation of onDragListener, and this being a trivial little book example, I elected to implement that on the activity itself. And so the activity implements onDragListener, and the activity therefore has eventually an onDrag method, where you're provided the view that the user has done something related to drag and drop, and a drag event letting you know what exactly happened. And we will come back to this method here momentarily. So you call setOnDragListener, provide your drag listener. Particularly for single app drag and drop, you're also then responsible for initiating the drag and drop operation. And that you'll do that by calling start drag, or starting with Android 7.0 that has been renamed to start drag and drop. Be more inclusive. It's not just about the drag, it's both about the drag and the drop. And so you'll call that with 4 parameters. You'll provide a clip data representing the data that is the drag and drop operation. We'll talk more about that in a bit. You'll provide a view drag shadow builder. That's responsible for creating the visual representation of the drag and drop. What is the user physically, more or less, manipulating on the screen as they slide their finger around? What's the visual representation that they are dragging with them? We'll take a look at that more in a bit. There is a local state object We'll talk about more of that in a bit, and some flags which historically have been ignored but become much more important here with Android 7.0. We'll talk about those more in a bit. First up, the clip data. This name may sound familiar. You may have worked with clip data in the past, and as the name would suggest, this originated with the clipboard APIs. If you are going to do copy-paste sorts of things, you are going to be copying stuff to the clipboard, and you do that in the form of a clip data object. Clip data is used in a few other places, including here with the drag and drop environment. Typically, for fairly conventional uses of clip data, you'll use one of 4 factory methods. New plain text, say, hey, I've got a clip data that represents this hunk of ordinary text. New HTML text, and that for where you've got HTML markup that might be used by the whole rich text spannable sort of interface by other apps. If the content is represented by a URI, like, oh, I don't know, a video, and that you can use new raw URI to say, here is the URI representing this piece of content, or new intent, and that where you can say, oh, okay, I'm going to have a full intent, maybe with a URI and an action string, and maybe some extras, or whatever else you want to package into that, where in theory, you're trying to convince the other applications to go use that intent for something like starting an activity. There are other ways of setting up one of these clip datas and that, but typically, you'll be able to get away with using one of those 4 methods. The shadow, represented by the drag shadow builder, is again the visual representation that the user is manipulating, and you got 2 options for how you create this. The easy one is that you invoke the constructor of the drag shadow builder and you give it a view object. And what the system will then do is it's going to do capture a bitmap of the current representation of that view, and that's what gets dragged around. In many cases, this is fine. You know, if you're trying to reorder things in a list, probably you're going to want to just use a snapshot of the list row and that the user is sliding up and down in order to reposition it. Some cases it may be a little large and you may want to do something else and that. Or maybe you don't want it to be the actual content, but you want some sort of iconographic representation of the content, something like that. If you want anything other than a simple view that you already have, you can create a subclass of drag shadow builder, override a couple of methods to describe this is what the shadow should look like and this is how big it should be. And we'll take a look at an implementation of that approach coming up a little later. So I mentioned that I have a recycler view that's representing that list, and so therefore I've got a recycler view holder named row controller, and I'm having that respond to long click events. And if the user long clicks on an entry in the list, that's when we want to start the drag and drop. My videos are represented by URIs, and so that's an easy way for me to be able to pass around a unique identifier for this video. And so I wrap that URI, here labeled video URI, in a clip data using the new raw URI factory method. I create a view drag shadow builder based off of the thumbnail image view, and that it is inside of my row. And so they'll be dragging and dropping the thumbnail of the video, as opposed to, say, the whole row. And then I call start drag. This has been around again since API level 11. My min SDK version is like 15 or something on this project, and so I can call start drag. If I wanted to call start drag and drop, I would need to have a min SDK version of 24 or do version checks and call one or the other as appropriate. And so I pass in the clip data, I pass in the shadow, I pass in my local data, my local state, which here is true, because true represents what is all, good in the world as opposed to, evil values like false. And that in many samples, you'll look and you'll see that that's null, and that we'll see why I'm specifically passing true, or at least a non-null value, coming up a little later. And the 4th parameter is flags. This is a classic example, and that aimed for local drag and drop, and so I'm not using any flags, because there really weren't much of significance in those flags, and that early on. We'll see where some of those flags become much more important here with Android 7.0 coming up in a bit. So, long press on the row, call start drag, this initiates the drag and drop. So, This now will start triggering those onDrag methods on the onDrag listeners of all of the registered drop targets at the point in time when start drag was called. And there is an action code associated with each one of those drag events. You're going to need to look at that and do a switch or an equivalent in order to handle the different events. Action drag started says that something called start drag or start drag and drop, and you are a candidate drop target. You need to look at the data associated with this drag event, such as the MIME type of the content, and return true if you wish to continue being considered a drop target. If you return false from onDrag, you're saying, yeah, okay, I don't know how to deal with this particular thing, I'm just gonna ignore it. And you will not receive any more drag events related to this particular drag and drop operation. Then, if you do return true, probably eventually you'll get an action drag entered action. This indicates that the user has dragged that shadow into the boundaries of whatever this drop target is. And so, all views at the end of the day wind up being rectangles, even if visually they aren't, and that the user has basically dragged that shadow such that it is overlapping your drop target. And so you know that if the user were to let go at this point in time, it would be dropped over you. You might do some additional rendering here or something to hint to the user that, hey, you as a drop target are alive at this point. Action drag location would be called after action drag entered, indicating that the user is still dragging and dropping and is still inside of your boundaries, but they have moved inside of those boundaries. You can get the actual XY coordinates of the drag event to know precisely where they dropped it, and you might use that information as part of either your temporary rendering here or eventually when they actually drop it. On the other hand, if you don't really care about the precise positioning inside of the drop target, you'll probably ignore action drag location events. Action drag exited, the opposite of entered. The user has now dragged the item outside of your drop target's boundaries, and so if you did any special rendering in onDrag entered, you probably want to unwind that here in action drag exited. Action drop says that the user actually did complete the drag and drop operation, and you, lucky devil, are the one who's the drop target that the user dropped over. Now that drag event gives you access to the whole clip data. You're going to be able to use that information to go in and do something useful. And then you need to return true, indicating, yes, this drag is successful. I have accepted this content. We consider the drag to be completed. If, on the other hand, you look at the full clip data and you say, yeah, okay, I don't know what to do with this thing, and you return false, basically you are rejecting that drop attempt and the system will react accordingly. Action drag ended, you'll get that event when the drag and drop operation is over, including if the user dropped over some other drop target, so your drop target can unwind anything that it may have done in action drag started. And so overall, in action drag started, you're going to validate that the drop request is possibly valid for you. In action drop, you're going to do the real work related to the drag and drop. And for all those other events, if you pay attention to them, that's mostly for rendering purposes. So you can highlight your drop targets in one form or fashion and to give the user some clues that this is a place that is worthy of attempting to drop as opposed to arbitrary spots in your UI. So, back in my activity, back in that onDrag method, I look at the event's action, switch on that. If it's drag started, I am going to get that local state object and see whether or not it's null. And if it is null, I am going to return false from this overall method. Result is my overall return value. You might wonder why I'm bothering with this. After all, I just showed you I was passing Boolean true in for the local state in my start drag call. That gets into cross-app drag and drop. We'll talk more about that coming up shortly, but take it on faith for the moment that there is some method to the madness. Otherwise, I'm assuming that if this is not null, then it's my own drag and drop, and I'm supporting all of my own drag and drops. I don't need to look at the clip data, MIME type or anything like that to confirm whether or not I can use it. But what I do is call a private apply drop hint method. That's going to add a shape drawable around this particular drop target, a dashed red outline, indicating to the user that this is a candidate drop target. And therefore, if they were to drag over this particular drop target, I would do something helpful. If they actually enter that drop target, I'm going to replace the dashed red outline with a solid green outline, indicating, hey, I am now the active drop target. If you were to lift your finger or stylus or whatever off the screen at the moment and drop this here, I'm going to be the one who processes the event. If they exit this drop target, I'll roll back to the red outline. If the drag and drop ends, I will get rid of the outline entirely, -1 being my hint, my apply drop hint method, saying that, hey, we aren't doing any particular outline, revert back to your original state. Then in action drop, I can get at that URI. A clip data can hold one or more clip data.item objects. Those factory methods create single item clip data objects. And so I can get the 0th item, get the URI out of that clip data item, and either hand it to the video view for playback or use Picasso, and a standard recipe for going in and populating the larger image view. That's it. And so I long press, I drag, I drop, and that you see that the borders change as the drag and drop goes on, and the drop targets consume the events. Note, no actual Googlers were harmed in the creation of this demo. So that's how drag and drop works. But now it's Android 7.0. We can have 2 windows on our mobile devices in split screen mode. There's also picture-in-picture for televisions, Android TV. Drag and drop isn't going to be relevant for those scenarios for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which that people don't usually, their touchscreen, televisions are not touchscreens. There's also the legendary free-form multi-window mode, where Android would behave more like a desktop operating system with multiple overlapping windows. At the moment, free-form multi-window mode is a mythological creature on par with unicorns, and therefore we don't really know exactly how that's going to work. Frequently, from the user standpoint, the split screen is going to be 2 separate apps. They've got your app on one side and they've got some other app on the other side because, they are watching the movie and they are rather watching, like the football game, and they've got, some sort of a, tweet stream or whatever going on in another window. But you can, with a compile SDK version of 24 or higher, use flag activity launch adjacent as a flag on the intent that you pass into start activity. That says, hey, Android, if we're in multi-window mode now, please start this activity in another window. And so in split screen mode, your original activity is in one pane, you call start activity with flag activity launch adjacent, and that activity will show up in the other pane. If the device is not in split screen mode at the moment, start activity just behaves as normal. It ignores that flag. This will not put the device in split screen mode. As far as I know, there's no way of an app doing that from the Android SDK standpoint. So let's talk about start doing cross-app drag and drop. This is where those flags start to come in. For starting a drag and drop operation, you have to opt in to saying that this is going to be across apps. So instead of passing in 0 for your flags, you're going to want to think about adding in other flags. The big one being drag flag global, saying, all right, I want this drag and drop to be device-wide. URI read says that the URI and the data, you've got read access to it. Persistable URI permission says, and you can take persistable URI permissions to hold on to this for the longer term. So in another sample app, where I've got an activity that on the drag side is just a large image view, I have that image view being served up from assets using Stream Provider, which is an analog of file provider providing somewhat more flexibility of where you can serve content from, including directly from assets or resources. Stream Provider is from a library written by some balding guy. And so I've got a clip data pointing to this photo that I have in assets. I create a thumb drag shadow, which we'll talk about in a moment, and I call start drag and drop. And in particular here, I am saying I am opting in to cross-app drag and drop. I want this to be global in scope. That thumb drag shadow is because my whole activity is a big image view. I don't want to have the user dragging this huge photo from point to point because it's kind of large. And so thumb drag shadow, I create my own custom subclass of drag shadow builder. I'm provide shadow metrics. You're going to provide information about how big the shadow should be and where is the finger inside of the shadow. I say, let's make it 1/8 the size of the image view, and we'll have the finger be in the center. And then on draw shadow, you're passed in a canvas. Your job is to draw into that canvas what the visual representation is. Canvas will already be set up with the proper size. I just pass that canvas onto the image view and say, hey, could you draw to this canvas in addition to the regular canvas you normally draw to? And it will happily render itself into the small representation. To consume a cross-app drag and drop event, you do absolutely nothing. Your app automatically, if you register a drop target, you not only will get drag and drop operations from your app, but drag and drop operations from any other app. This is not a good thing. Drag and drop is effectively an indirect form of IPC, and in particular, if we were expecting this to all be within our own app, this should not be going in and automatically extending it to other apps just without some sort of an opt-in the way we had to with the drops or the drag events. I found a bug. They're, I'm sure, diligently working on it. But what we were told the workaround is to take advantage of that local state. That third parameter to start drag and drop is an object. Any object, whatever Java class you want, does not have to be parcelable. Whenever you see this, you know that ain't passing across process boundaries. And so therefore, it's got to be within the app. And so what you do is you pass some non-null value for the local state. Then in your onDrag, you look at the local state in action drag started. If that local state is null, you know that that did not come from your start drag call, or at least that's what we think. And that it may have come from some other app, and so you reject the cross-app drag and drop. On the other hand, if it's not null, you know that had to come from your own app, couldn't have come from another app, and therefore you proceed as normal. So that's the closest thing we have to a workaround for trying to make sure that we are only doing local stuff until we're ready to consume cross-app drag and drop events. And so I've got two apps. The one on the left is where I'm doing the drag. The one on the right is a totally separate app in the split screen, and it gets the URI. It is capable of then reading that URI published from the first app and using that to render in its own image view. However, that local state trick doesn't actually work quite as advertised, because the local state is not local to the process. It's local to the window. In particular, if you use flag activity launch adjacent to say, I want to have two activities of my own app side by side, the local state is not passed from one window to the other. You cannot distinguish between two of your windows and your window and some other window where that other window happened to initiate the drag event. This sucks, and that it boils down to, if you're really trying to get into multi-window and support it well, try to support drag events initiated from other apps. And then look at the clip data, look at the MIME type, validate it, return false where appropriate from OnDrag and so on, and accept what you can when it's initiated by third-party apps. Google didn't initiate multi-window in Android. The two leading previous implementations were from Samsung and LG. Cross-app drag and drop does work with Samsung for simple text. And it will not work with URIs because it doesn't automatically grant the permissions. There were no of those flags for granting read access to the URIs or things like that. And LG, I couldn't get cross-app drag and drop to work at all. They didn't extend the framework to support that. You're welcome to say that there are additional things that appear in your UI that are dedicated hotspots for drag and drop actions, such as the home screen. You long press on the launcher icon. Not only can you drag and create a shortcut, but then you get like the app info and the uninstall and the other little doodads, where if you drag over those, you're saying, I'm not trying to create something here, I am trying to do an action using this drag and drop operation. Basically, when you start the Draggin event, you need to show your drop targets first. The drop targets need to be visible, or at least not gone, at the point in time when you call start drag or start drag and drop. At the time of start drag and drop, the framework, the system goes through, finds all registered drop targets, and effectively collects them in a list. If while the drag and drop is ongoing, new drop targets get registered, they're ignored by this particular drag and drop operation. And so therefore you have to make sure that your stuff, these action drop targets are alive enough that they are captured as part of this drag and drop operation. Otherwise they'll appear, but they won't get drop events, and therefore your user can't drop on them. So for example, I have another implementation of the first sample where I want to have a dedicated video info drop action. My row controller, where I'm actually doing the start drag call on a long click, I also want to let my hosting activity know, hey, we're about to start a drag and drop operation. So I have a listener interface with an onStart drag method that I'm going to be calling, and so whoever creates this row controller is going to pass in an instance of that listener. My activity is an implementation of that listener, and I have an onStart drag call where in a production grade app I would do this nice animated effect and that of causing my info little drop action to appear, and this being a crude book example, and that I just do a smash cut and make it be visible right away. But I have to make it be not gone so that it's registered as even though it's registered as a drop target, it also has to be not gone for the system to pay attention to it. And that means that I can now, when I do a long press, now all of a sudden my video info appears, I can drag on it, and in this case I just show a toast with the URI of what the video was. But you can obviously do something more sophisticated. The gentleman who was sitting up here a moment ago but left, and that was Dan Liu, and that he left because he has a presentation in the next time slot, and that he reported a couple of bugs related to drag and drop. And that particularly revolving around the scenario where you have a drop target that holds onto other drop targets. Fairly common in cases where you're like reordering things in a list or something. You need to make sure that whether the user winds up lifting their finger up over one of the other rows in the list or over some background area of the list that's visible, that you get the drop events for all of those. On Android 6.0 and earlier, the drag events were considered to be inclusive, by which if you are inside an inner target, you are also inside to the outer target as well, and that's reflected in the nature of the drag events that are handed to your onDrag method. So for example, I've got drag and drop demonstrating this, where on Android 6.0 and higher, I change the background based upon the drag events, and you see that when I'm inside the inner squares, I'm also effectively inside that outer yellow square, and so all of those wind up being green. But on Android 7.0, the DragEvents are considered to be exclusive. Children are not part of the parent. If you enter a child, you exit the parent. Which basically means that the same code running on Android 7 gives me this, where only the one that you are directly over on the z-axis is the one that's going to be considered where the drop target is. I can argue either way, and now the problem here is that it's a change. It's a regression. Code that had worked before now stops working. Just yesterday, the bugs were updated with future release, and that we were told in particular that for the specific bug that I demonstrated, that they will change it such that the new behavior will only be for apps with a target SDK version of 24 or higher. So basically, you know that you're going to get the deviating behavior and can hopefully adapt your app to cope with it. What they don't, of course, say with the future release on those bugs is exactly when that release is going to be. Is this a 7.0 patch? Is this a 7.1 that's been rumored? Is this, what is when we're going to get that? Bear in mind that at least as of the last time I looked for it in material design, which was last week, there is no guidance for what you should do to stylize your drop targets. I feel fairly confident that the official answer from Google when they write it up will not be use a dashed red border to indicate a possible drop target and a solid green border to indicate a live drop target. They will probably do something else because they've got style and I don't. But we're going to need to figure out whether by material design or other conventions how we're going to represent drop targets to people. And bear in mind that drag and drop is not especially accessible. It's not great for people who are visually impaired, motor control impaired, and so forth. Make sure you've got some other way of doing the same sorts of operations. One nice thing about this being driven by clip data is that you could consider using the clipboard. You could do copy-paste sorts of things. You could say, oh, okay, well, in addition to dragging from this app into that app, I will also allow this app to copy that thing to the clipboard, and then the user in the other app can do a paste, and that whether it's action bar items with associated keyboard shortcuts, whatever. So, the things that you really ought to be thinking about doing. If you already have a drag and drop stuff, check for that bug, but also check for the cross-app stuff. And that. See what happens if in split screen mode some other app starts a drag operation and the user drops into your window. What happens? Do you survive? Do you blow up? And that. Also, if you are in the business of representing collections of content, particularly content represented by URIs, please consider supporting global drag events. Add flag drag global and the related flags to your intents so that you offer these events to other apps. So if you're implementing the file manager or the media player or something like that, please consider supporting this. Because with drag and drop between apps, as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. And so until both sides implement support, the cross-app stuff isn't really going to take off. And so think about what users are going to expect with your app, particularly in multi-window environments. Maybe they aren't expecting stuff for split screen specifically, but for free-form multi-window mode, they're probably going to be starting to think about, okay, what do I usually do with a desktop operating system with drag and drop? Can I do that with my Android apps? And it would be ideal if your apps would play ball. If you implement your side of the drag and drop, whether it's starting the drag events or accepting the drop events, and that hopefully if other developers are doing the same thing, then we get this nice ecosystem of cross-app drag and drop going. And I am out of time, and so so for those of you with questions, I will be outside, and that I'll happily take them there. Thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.